Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. Today we want to talk about something that I didn't know much about before I started researching for this, and now I want to know a lot about it because it's an important topic. Electromagnetic pulse, EMP, which can be caused either by nature or by man, poses an existential threat to our electronic civilization. A nationwide blackout lasting 1 year could kill millions, up to 90% of the American people, through starvation, disease, and societal change. Moreover, EMP, as it's called, is the ultimate cyber weapon in the military doctrines and plans of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Joining me to discuss these very alarming issues are Dr. Vincent Pry, Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and the author of the newly released The Power and Light, the Congressional EMP Commission, War to Save America 2001 to 2020, which can be found on Amazon. He also served as the Congressional EMP Commission Chief of Staff and with the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission, House Armed Services Committee, and the CIA. Also joining me is my frequent collaborator and friend, Frank Gaffney. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Reagan and founder of the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. Frank, Peter, welcome. Peter, you've done a lot on electromagnetic pulse. What is electromagnetic? Let me get it out here.
Easy for you to say.
You've been saying electromagnetic pulse.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Well, an electromagnetic pulse or an EMP is, in terms of the physics, is basically a distortion in space-time, which is basically what a radio wave is, except an EMP is very much like a radio wave, except that it's got so much energy in it. It's like think of it as a super energetic radio wave with so much energy that it will actually destroy electronics, and it can destroy electronics across the vast region. In the case of the natural EMP threat from the sun, it can cause electric grids and electrical critical infrastructures to collapse all over the world. The EMP would be so vast that it would affect the entire planet. A nuclear weapon, detonated above the United States, so high up in outer space that you wouldn't even hear the blast or the explosion. There'd be no other effects, no radioactive fallout, no radiation reaching to the surface of the Earth, just the EMP. But that EMP would be enough to destroy electronic systems across an entire continent, and, across all 48 contiguous United States, most of Canada, and a good chunk of Mexico with a single weapon. And then there are non-nuclear EMP weapons, that can be actually purchased almost by anyone, and you don't even need a license to purchase some sort of non-nuclear EMP devices that can be used as weapons. And we have developed, and other countries all over the world have developed non-nuclear EMP weapons. The radius of effect is not so great, but if you had a team of terrorists or special forces guys carrying 9 or 10 of these things to critical points of the North American grid, again, you could collapse the whole electrical grid without a nuclear EMP weapon, just using these non-nuclear EMP devices.
Well, the naturally occurring ones, solar superstorm, I mean, is a sun. What's the term for what the sun does when it explodes and causes
this?
It's
coronal mass ejection. Basically, it's a big chunk of the sun that comes flying out of a sunspot. It's, millions of degrees of ionized plasma, traveling more than 1 million miles an hour in the case of a solar superstorm.
And this is something that happened here in 1859.
That's right. It's the most powerful solar superstorm we know of. Happened, back in 1859. There probably have been more powerful ones than that, but it's the most powerful one we have on record, and we know about it chiefly because just at the dawn of the electrical age, we're not yet an electrical civilization, but electronic devices like this, which is a telegraph key from that period of 1859. And these devices were all over the world on every continent except Antarctica. Everywhere the colonial powers, built a railroad. They would string telegraph cables and put up a telegraph system. So they were everywhere in Asia, Europe, North and South America, and all over the world as a consequence of the 1859 Carrington event. The telegraph systems not only failed, but failed catastrophically. A key like that, and even your viewers can probably see what a clunky, crude piece of electronics that
Hold
is.
it up. Yeah, let me
The
do it
keys
again.
actually melted. The wooden bases caught on fire. Telegraph stations burned down.
And this happened to the whole system, everything.
Yeah, it happened everywhere in the world. And there were forest fires from
Yeah.
telegraph wires bursting into flames. And we had just laid the transatlantic cable in 1859, connecting North America to Europe. And the pulse was so powerful, it reached miles down into the Atlantic Ocean and damaged that cable, destroyed that cable. It took until 1869 to run the cable again. And the point is, this is an easy way of illustrating how vulnerable we are. Because, we were in the horse and buggy days back then. We were not yet an electronic civilization. And so civilization didn't come to an end because survival didn't depend upon the electronic systems. But if something like this could be destroyed all over the planet, just think about our modern microelectronics, which operate on tiny voltages compared to this. Then they're not nearly as robust as a telegraph key. In fact, modern microelectronics are literally a billion times, with a B, a billion times more vulnerable to this natural EMP phenomenology than the telegraph keys of 1859.
Frank, you've been following this for years. How pervasive is knowledge that this problem or this threat exists?
Well, I have a confession to make. I've learned most of what I know about it from Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. So my experience has largely been informed by what he's taught me. And one of the things that he's impressed upon me and that I've subsequently learned a lot about is that parts of our country know a lot about this and have for decades. In fact, when I was in the Pentagon, I think this was my first exposure to electromagnetic pulse because it was at the time a very closely held secret. It was a matter of national security survival that we protected critical weapon systems and communication devices
This was known to
against
the
this
Pentagon.
EMP.
It was held as in
Yeah, I have
secret.
a fascinating story. Peter and
Yeah.
I both have as a friend Senator Bob Hall of Texas, who we first met, thanks to Peter, when he and I went down to brief the Texas state legislature about this problem and the imperative need for Texas, which has the advantage of having its own electric grid, to take steps to protect it. Well, it turns out Peter ran into this senator by the name of Bob Hall from East Texas, and he said, I need to tell you about this. And it turned out the fellow knew a lot about it because back when he was a young captain in the Air Force in the early 1960s, he was one of the guys who was put in charge of an emergency effort to protect what was then the state-of-the-art of our nuclear forces, our Minuteman II missile systems, against EMP, which had just been discovered by a friend and colleague of ours by the name of William Graham. So this has been known about for a long time. DOD has worked to protect us against it,
So
but
was
the rest
the
of society not so
EMP
much.
discovered? I mean, in 1859, did anybody know what was happening? Or
Well-
was this something that we, in the last 30, 40 years, have figured out what causes it, but then we also figured out how we can cause it?
It's a complicated story, which is actually in the book, The Power and the Light. But the Carrington event, the astronomer Carrington, they didn't know about the electromagnetic pulse phenomena, the connection between what had happened. One of the things Carrington knew, he knew that something had happened that caused an aurora borealis that was so intense that you could read newspapers by the light in London, all right? And this was the case all over the world. But it wasn't until much later that people made the connection between the fact of the failure of the telegraph systems and the Carrington and the Carrington event. And as a matter of fact, we knew about the nuclear EMP phenomena before we knew about the catastrophic consequences of a super energetic solar flare. And as a matter of fact, our friend and colleague, the free world's foremost expert on EMP, is Dr. William Graham. He was actually a young defense scientist who was at he was responsible for participating in the defense science team that discovered the EMP phenomena after the 1962 Starfish Prime high-altitude nuclear burst. The lights went out on Hawaii. There was all kinds of damage to electronic systems, and people didn't know why. This was in 1962 as a result of the starfish prime. So Graham and other of our Albert Einstein level type scientists went to look at that. And I was actually present at the discovery of the idea that the sun could also pose a catastrophic consequences, because it was Dr. Graham who came up with that. Along the way, I mean, this is the quality of mind you're talking about with Dr. Graham. In addition to having figured out and laid the foundations for EMP science, later on he went on to become President Reagan's White House science advisor and also ran NASA. And while he was running NASA, he became aware of these solar storms and the rest. And when the EMP Commission was meeting, he was pacing back in front of the commission, in front of a blackboard, and said, we've been tasked to look at the nuclear EMP threat to our country, but Mother Nature can also cause this. And every 150 years or so, there's going to be something like another Carrington.
Aren't the odds something like 10 to 12% per decade? That's
right,
something
12%
that like this could
12% per decade.
Has one happened since 1959?
Oh, we have solar storms happen every year.
Yeah.
Okay, but the big ones, the ones that could pose a civilizational conflict, they happen about once a century. We were narrowly missed on July 23rd, 2012, by a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection. It missed the Earth by about 3 days. And that's when NASA sat down and said, well, we'd better figure out what the likelihood is. And they came up with, their best guess was 12% per decade, which means we're overdue for one.
Yeah, I was going to say, our time is,
Seriously,
we're on the other side
that's
of the
an extraordinarily
probabilities.
high level of risk. It virtually guarantees that within our lifetimes, or no later that of our grandchildren, the Earth is going to get hit by one of these.
So if this happened with this kind of intensity again now, what would the impact be?
The impact would be catastrophic. Power grids would collapse all over the world, and all of this life-sustaining critical infrastructures, telecommunications, transportation, business, finance, even food and water depend directly or indirectly upon electricity. And advanced electronic civilization in the whole world, even in African countries, depend upon electricity now for the survival of their people.
So banking goes down, funds transfer goes down, fuel pipelines go down, the whole thing.
Immediately, there's no water. People can't get water.
Yeah.
How do you sustain a population of 330 million people with no water? We only have enough food to feed 330 million people in this country for 30 days, and it will begin to spoil as soon as the electricity fails because of the temperature control systems and refrigerators.
This goes back to what Peter was saying a moment ago, Bill. When that happened, people were largely unaffected by it because they weren't dependent upon all of these technologies. Right. They knew how to grow food. This is the other piece of this. The number of us that would be actually in a position to try to fill the gap
Not
of
many.
food production, let alone know what to do about it, is trivially small. So you would see mass starvation, and as you said at the outset, and this is so worrying because look at what's happening in America right now with violent disorder and mayhem in lots of cities across this country. Imagine if that were fueled by a desperate need for food or water or shelter of some kind.
So the things I need to understand is, in those cases, we've got a natural occurring risk, and there are things we can do to help mitigate that in terms of our infrastructure and our grid.
Yes.
But then we've also got, you've just written a terrific report called China, the EMP Threat, and then we've got aggressive state actors who would love to create an event if they could and get away with it. So we've got to defend against that, but they also need to protect the grid in either event.
That's right. Yeah, I wrote that report as sort of sending up a flare, because right now we're actually standing on the threshold of a potential China EMP event, and we're so preoccupied with the chaos on our streets that people aren't paying attention to what's happening with China. China doesn't regard the use of a nuclear weapon to make an EMP attack as a nuclear war. They consider it, as do the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans, as a form of gray zone aggression, like cyber warfare, okay, or electronic warfare. In their doctrine, that's where it's categorized. And in this March, China, a team of Chinese military experts got together to to explore what could we do to stop the United States from showing the flag in the South China Sea, challenging our sovereignty to the South China Sea. And they said overtly in March, well, one of the things we could do is an EMP attack in an aircraft carrier group. It would fry all the ships, but it wouldn't kill anybody, because the pulse, wouldn't only destroys the electronics. And so that would be something short of kinetic warfare that we could do. And now we have 2 aircraft carriers getting ready to show the flag in the biggest way we've ever done in the South China Sea to challenge their sovereignty, which is why I wrote that report, to just remind the powers that be that China's been planning for an EMP attack both against our carriers and against the U.S. homeland for more than a quarter century. And the report is largely quotes just from China's military doctrine.
One moment, you're watching the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Peter Vincent Pry and Frank Gaffney, and we're talking about the electromagnetic pulse, and both the natural occurring pulse and also the man-made ones, and both of which we need to worry a lot about. But coming back to the Chinese, you cited some reports in this. They were thinking about this in the late 1990s. I mean,
Yes.
they said aircraft carriers are terrific. They're easy to spot, and they're totally dependent on electronic systems. And so for EMP, it's a sitting duck.
Right.
Unfortunately, this is part of the litany of different ways that they figured out and wrote in a published book called Unrestricted Warfare about, for taking down the United States without going to full-on kinetic warfare with us at a moment when they weren't strong enough to do that. But you look at that list, Bill, and our friend Kevin Freeman, who's appeared on your program before, has really studied this closely. They've been working through that checklist, whether it's economic warfare, whether it's now, I would argue, going back to a point you made a moment ago, civil strife in our streets, or whether it's electromagnetic pulse. These are things that are not simply possible lines of attack against us by the Chinese Communist Party, but I believe ones that are operational, in some cases actually used already.
I want to keep going with China. I still want to lay kind of the foundation of when we understood this power that it has, and bringing us up current and what we've done subsequently as a country. And you write a lot about the bureaucratic infighting among the agencies, and we've identified a problem, and yet, and this is alarming, and yet a lot of people's eyes roll. They say, oh, the electromagnetic, the EMT, that's nothing. Now, what are we up against here in terms of making people understand that this is real and that there are risks we've got to mitigate?
Well, it's still a really serious problem. The fact that this is probably the greatest existential threat that our civilization faces. Because it is so easily executed. Even terrorists who could get their hands on a single nuclear weapon, could use a meteorological balloon to do this. And yet it is still one of the least understood threats. And one of the things we're also working against is an uphill battle against the very powerful electric power industry. The utilities, the electric utilities, they're the last critical infrastructure that basically regulates themselves. And they're protecting against cyber warfare, against physical sabotage, against EMP. When they've been losing the battle, the handful of experts that have been pursuing this for 20 years, that's why the subtitle of my book is The Congressional EMP Commission's War to Save America, because it has literally been a war of ideas and a war of activism, just like we had during the Cold War, a war of theories to try to convince people that, look, you've got to deal with this threat. The science supports this threat. But groups like the Electric Power Research Institute will put out junk science studies. They're a lobby for the electric power industry. NERC is the biggest of them, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. They have more than $150 million a year to spread around in lobbying, and which they do, and to put out bogus studies that play down the EMP threat and say, oh, it's not that serious. Then when they lose that argument, they'll say, well, we're the real EMP experts because we control the grid, so trust us. We will take care of the problem.
And where does some of that money come from for these utility industry
40% of the
lobbies?
research budget for EPRI, for example, comes from foreign sources, including Russia and China. Exactly.
Yeah, China.
What could possibly go wrong? Here you have countries that have every interest in keeping us vulnerable to a sort of attack that they can envision using decisively to take us down, and possibly do so without being tagged for it or having retaliation against them. And they're able to influence us by using our own lobbying operations to try to keep us in that state. It's just unbelievable. But this is part of what this war has been about. And I want to salute Peter Pry as one of the unsung heroes in this war. Nobody has done with his writings, with his interviews, with his public speeches, with his advocacy more, nobody, than Peter Pry to raise awareness about this problem and to make clear how huge the stakes are.
Well, how much,
Thank you,
in the
Frank.
industry's case, we've got a case of regulatory capture where
Yes.
the regulators
Absolutely.
it's a revolving door
Classic
between
case.
the industry. And the industry's agenda is mainly economic. They don't want to spend the money for the backup or the whatever it is that we need to do to mitigate this.
I'm not sure.
Or is
that
their
it-
agenda something else?
Tell them the story about our meeting with.
Yeah, I think the agenda has more to do with power than it does have to do with money, because it wouldn't really cost that much to protect the National Electric Grid. But we had a meeting.
I think
with
you said $2 billion, $3 billion.
2 to 4 billion,
2 to
yeah, is
4
what the
billion.
EMP Commission estimated
Yeah.
back in 2008 to protect the national bulk power system. Probably 10 to 20 billion if you wanted to protect all of the critical infrastructures. But that wouldn't be taxpayer money, by the way. You know, one of the it would be done painlessly. You know, and we have as a society proven that we can already protect ourselves against EMP because there is a kind of other natural EMP that almost everything is protected against, called lightning. In the EMP world, this is called E2 EMP. It's a mid-frequency kind of a phenomenon. And almost everything electronic these days is designed to survive lightning. It's got a little surge arresters in it, even the personal computer on your desk. And how was that done? It was done by adopting best practices and engineering the lightning protection right into the electronic systems. So we don't even think about it anymore. You know, the cost gets absorbed as the cost of manufacturing. It only adds 1 to 6% to the cost to harden something against nuclear and natural EMP, 1 to 6%.
So let's stay with the
No, but
industry
just take this.
pushback to do something about it. Go ahead, Frank.
This is really relevant to the point.
Yeah.
Peter and I visited with the fellow who at the time was the director of, the president, I guess, of something called the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And Peter, I'll never forget it, Peter put the question to him right out of the box. What did you say?
Yeah, I asked him, what if the Department of Defense paid for this? Because the Department of Defense would have tremendous interest. So $2 to $4 billion, that's nothing in their
Coffee
budget.
money.
But it would guarantee that their 100 military bases in CONUS would continue to operate if they would harden the grid. And Jerry turned that down. He said, no, we still wouldn't do it. And so I don't think it's chiefly the money. I think they don't want what would come they don't want the inspections that would come. They don't want the oversight that would come with government. They want to continue to regulate themselves and be opaque and not transparent to the regulatory organizations. And one of the reasons for that you can see happened last year in California. All right, the California wildfires, you know, were caused because the electric power industry is so irresponsible. Not only aren't they protecting things against EMP and cyber, but they're not even protecting against like the Santa Ana winds that can knock down 100-year-old power line towers and cause forest fires that kill hundreds of people and wipe out whole towns. They had rolling blackouts over California trying to anticipate where the winds were going to be high enough to endanger power line towers. Nor were they even implementing such common sense, simple things as vegetation management by cutting down trees and branches. So, and these are things that the regulatory system is supposed to already require them to do, okay, by NERC and FERC, but they got away with it for years. And what was their final solution? What was their plan? You know, their plan to evade responsibility for all this was to declare bankruptcy, so that they couldn't be sued by the state or by individuals and families who had lost their lives. That's what you're dealing with.
So the grid is owned privately throughout the United States?
Yes, 3,000 utilities, yeah.
3,000
Most-
utilities,
there are a few
and technically, what is the grid? It's power stations, it's the connecting lines, it's,
Right. The generators, the extra high voltage transformers, and the control systems are the three big, you know, most important
what's the
components
value of our
power line.
investment in the grid?
Oh, it's probably, I'd guess it's probably about $1 trillion
Yeah.
at least.
And now
And that's-
Texas
that's
is
the
the only
way
one
we-
that's not part of, we're all
It
interconnected.
has its own. It has
Texas
its own,
has its own
covering
grid.
largely the state of Texas. But here's
Okay.
the thing, Bill. That's what we started with. it essentially came about when a couple of neighborhoods were electrified. And then everybody wanted some of it, and ultimately we got to rural areas. But it grew like topsy, and not in the most efficient, certainly not in the most standardized way. What's an option today, which I think is clearly part of the solution here, we've got to do what we can to protect the grid we have, for sure. That investment is incalculably big and vitally needed, as we've discussed. But we also have the option of microgrids, which enable us to get away from some of the real vulnerabilities, like the electric transformers, these huge high-voltage transformers, and these big power lines. And one of the things that Peter and the EMP Commission have recognized is this kind of orderly migration to alternative means of getting power to people's homes and businesses is obviously part of the deal, too. But we've also got to get to the point where we can survive until those alternatives are available to us.
Yes, right. One of my ideal solutions long term, but the Commission's recommendations is we've got to protect the grid that exists. All right, and I certainly agree with that. But we can do better than this current big grid, which is almost designed so that it's ideally vulnerable to EMP phenomena. But one of my ideal solutions in the way of microgrids would be small modular nuclear reactors. Okay, the technology is there; it's available to us. This would break up the big grid. We could evolve away from the big grid. Every city could have its own independent power source, basically, and it would also change the politics of electric energy in a way so that it is much more responsive to the people. Do you know the customers, the consumers who consume electricity when NERC and FERC and all these guys to get together to talk about regulation? The people who actually pay the bills and are the consumers are not considered stakeholders. They don't have an interest, and their interests are not represented in these public meetings. And that was one of the things that's so dangerous and why it's been so neglected. I'd like to quickly add something here, because we've been beating up on the electric power industry, and they richly deserve it. But I really don't think, they're one of the chief reasons we're still vulnerable to EMP. But the bigger and more important reason is, frankly, I think we're in the middle of a civilizational crisis that most societies go through when it comes to our governmental elites. And we can see this manifested in, for example, in the incredibly incompetent response of government to the coronavirus. All right? We've invested decades and billions of dollars, supposedly, getting ready for biological warfare. And I would have said, hey, when a coronavirus comes along, we've invested decades and billions, so we're going to be able to handle the coronavirus with no problem. We even have a Center for Disease Control and a National Institute, and we even have an Assistant Secretary of Defense responsible for biological warfare, right? And all of these guys failed catastrophically. An intelligent high school student would have known to stockpile ventilators and masks and have pharmaceuticals, right? But none of that was done. What happened? Well, inside the Beltway, studies passes for taking action on things. And promoting yourself so that you can have new organizations and get a bunch of senior executive service people who get higher salaries. The money goes into their pockets. The money went into their pockets, and it didn't go into preparedness. And that's happening with EMP. It's been a year after President Trump signed his executive order, more than a year, and they haven't done anything except studies. They want to do studies that are unnecessary. They've been done before. And I think,
notably by the EMP Commission.
Right. Isn't there also, I keep going.
The contrast the government we have today, okay, with the government we had in the Great Generation, all right? The Great Generation that managed to pull itself out of the Great Depression and won World War II and invented the atomic bomb and invented nuclear energy and built the national highway system and sent a man to the moon. The difference between that government, all right, and the government today, what has changed in our civilization, in our government, that it used to be super competent, that it was able to do those things, and I think it's the same thing that happened to the Roman Empire. You started off with a Roman Empire that was run by generals and statesmen and people who understood power and knew how to use it and did practical things for a living. And then you got a bureaucracy. And when you get a couple of generations into that bureaucracy, these people didn't know how to run a business, or they were not generals. They didn't know how to do anything except the kind of thing that bureaucrats know how to do, which is to protect their own interests and to hide under their desks so they can evade responsibility for anything. And that's what we've gotten now. We're 2 or 3 generations into an administrative state, all right, that is so incompetent, that they can't even handle the coronavirus or make a website for Obamacare, for example, as we remembered last year. And the rot is even creeping into the Department of Defense, where we have a nuclear arsenal, for example, that is virtually obsolete, compared to what the Russians and Chinese and our adversaries are building.
You're watching The Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry and Frank Gaffney, and we're talking about the electromagnetic grid, or the electromagnetic pulse, EMP, and the problem, once again, with the deep state in protecting us from that risk. It's just another nail in the coffin of the deep state, I would hope.
Right,
No,
across
that's
the
more
board.
likely a coffin
Probably
is
a nail
ours.
in our coffin.
That's right. But just to develop
They'll be
this,
fine. They'll be
just to develop
be in
this.
Wyoming.
No, they'll be dead too, unfortunately. But the point is, when Peter and the commission and others of us who've been raising the alarm about this have asked the question, Bill, don't you have children? Don't you have stakeholders? Don't you have clients? Don't you have customers? Don't you have people that you want to assure survive? And the answer, of course, is whether they're government bureaucrats or whether they're electric power utilities executives, yes, they do. And yet the inertia or the simple disregard or the intention that it'll be somebody else's problem, it won't happen on my watch, I'll just muddle along, is so profound. And I just want Peter to tell you a story about something that happened back in June of 2015 with a guy who was coming to a meeting that Peter was addressing that we sponsored in Iowa. And he had a chance to give him a briefing and tell him what the conversation at the end
Just
of
to
that
set the
briefing
stage
was.
a bit, though, this commission's been stood up twice. I mean, there was a commission for about 10 years, been from, when was the first one?
Yeah, it was from 2001 to 2008. And then from after that, I established the EMP Task Force to sort of be a placeholder, which isn't the same thing as a commission, okay? And then we were around from 2016 until 2017, again, when we were reestablished. And now that the commission has gone out, basically the EMP Task Force continues to try to carry on the commission without the resources or powers.
You've got some very serious and thoughtful people involved in this. These are experts.
Oh yes, it was the greatest concentration of expertise on EMP, nuclear weapons design, the operation of critical infrastructures in the free world, and that's just another example of incompetence that both the Department of Defense and the Congress didn't see the value in continuing the EMP Commission and keeping it around. And then 18 months later, we have a presidential executive order that says, you shall protect the country. And Congress agreed with it. And then
That's from
passed the bill.
President Trump.
Yeah, President Trump.
But you just have to understand that backstory
Yeah, I want to hear
of
the
all
story
of the
about what-
alarms that were
Yeah.
raised and the fact that they were resisted so assiduously by the
Yeah.
deep state, by the electric utilities,
What's-
informed a conversation that you had with a fellow by the name of Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's
in
right.
June of 2015.
I owe that to Frank setting it up so that I had
This
an
is the very
opportunity.
same Donald Trump.
Providential.
Yeah, when he was before he
But
became
then,
president.
not even a candidate at that point.
Yeah.
Right. I had an opportunity to brief him for 45 minutes on the EMP threat. He hadn't heard of it, but he was intelligent enough. He understood it. He could see what an existential threat there was. And he asked me the
He's
question.
a builder.
Right.
He knows from infrastructure.
He asked me the question, well, how come, the government has allowed this vulnerability to continue? How could this be acceptable? And I explained to him that, the problem is the threat was so significant that nobody wanted to take responsibility for it. It was so big, it cut across so many responsibilities that nobody wanted to take responsibility.
And nobody had the mandate.
Nobody
responsible.
had the mandate. So the Department of Defense, for example, would say, well, an EMP from the sun is a natural threat, so that belongs to the Department of Homeland Security, and that's not our responsibility. The Department of Homeland Security would say, well, an EMP can be caused by a nuclear weapon or non-nuclear weapons, by terrorist attack, and so that's a DoD responsibility. And the Department of Energy, that is responsible for overseeing the electric grid, would say, well, this isn't, national security isn't our problem at all. so it belongs to somebody else, not us. And then candidate, Trump said to me after I gave the explanation, he said, well, don't worry, Doc. When I'm elected president, I'm going to knock their heads together, and we're going to solve this problem. And he walked away very confident about that. And basically, that's what his executive order does. It's an excellent executive order, and it basically does knock everybody's heads together. All the relevant departments and agencies are on the hot seat together to work together to solve the problem, and he doesn't trust them to solve the problem. The White House, the president himself, through his national security advisor, is responsible for basically running the program and seeing the country get protected. And every year they owe him a progress report under his executive order on how far they have come. Now, they are so bad that in the first progress report was due March 26th in 2020, 1 year after the executive order, and they didn't even do that, which is why I wrote my book. It's my progress report to the American people on how the deep state is failing them and is slow rolling and sabotaging the president's executive order.
He also did another executive order just earlier this year in which he said, we're not going to allow foreign governments to be integrated into our grid. And we talked about the Electric Power Research Institute and the Edison Electric Institute.
They're still getting funded to the
They're
tune of
still
30,
getting
40,
funded.
50%
But it's worse
from
than that, Bill.
China.
We've learned that not only are the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians able to use cyber to penetrate and manipulate and possibly weaponize our grid against us, but we've actually been buying some of these critical high voltage transformers from China and putting them into the grid. Again, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, and the SCADA systems too, which are the control systems, and they're just as important as the big
So
transformers.
we're as dependent on the Chinese here as we are, say, in the show you and I did with Rosemary Gibson on our dependence on them for our drugs.
Not quite as, but
Not quite as.
to the extent we have any
But I
vulnerability,
wanna-
it's insane.
I think we could talk about this for 12 hours, but I've got a time limit. Let's switch to China and what they're doing, what their plans are, and the smaller state actors that have ability to make things happen. You mentioned special operators with something in a small armament could set something like this off. I mean, what's the risk from without? We've got risk from within, obviously the deep state, et cetera.
Yeah, the threat from non-nuclear EMP weapons is even greater, much greater, obviously, than the threat from a nuclear EMP weapon, because many more bad actors can get their hands on non-nuclear EMP weapons and devices. There are devices that are available on the market that are made by U.S. manufacturers. One of them is called the EMP suitcase, for example, and it looks just like a suitcase. It's not intended to be used as a weapon. There are legitimate purposes for some of these EMP things. For example, the EMP suitcase, it puts out 100,000 volts per meter, over a short distance, out to a couple of hundred yards, and it's used as a diagnostic device. For example, when you're laying out at an airport, you don't want the radars on the control tower to be too close to the runway because it can fry the electronics in an aircraft and possibly cause a crash. And so before you lay out the airport, you can use this suitcase to figure out how far do things have to be spaced apart. Now, the manufacturer never intended it to be used as a weapon, but a madman, a criminal, a terrorist, we've arrived at a place technologically where a single individual, who had the money to buy this thing, and you don't need a license to buy it. Anyone can buy one. You could put it in the trunk of your car, drive up to an EHV transformer, just wait till the sparks and the flames start, then drive off to another one. And if you destroyed enough of those EHV transformers, there was
Who manufactures this?
the group is called American Electric, AEC, I think is the
Next thing you're going
acronym
to
for
tell
that.
me you can get it on Amazon.
Probably can, actually. In my book Blackout Wars, I have a picture of the thing that's taken from their advertisement for the EMP suitcase. But there was a
Could I just say
unclassified
at this
study.
point, it is criminally irresponsible
yeah.
for this not to be something that has to have some kind of restriction on access. And Peter's been warning about this for some time, and I'd rather you don't tell the next story, Peter, because it's evidence of the grievousness of our vulnerability. But the point is, responsible people are on notice of these vulnerabilities from the president on down. The fact that we're even having this conversation, Bill, honestly, 20 years or so after I first got exposed to this with Peter, among others, helping, is just, it's one of the biggest indictments I can think of our country, because it's a knowable problem. We have plenty of evidence of it, and it is a fixable one. Peter's given you an estimate of what it would cost. It would be lost in the noise. I mean, think about it. We spent $700 billion in a stimulus package back in the Obama years. We've spent,
More
I've
now.
lost track of how many
No,
trillions we've
I
spent
can't-
lately.
I've lost track, yeah.
For a fraction of that cost.
Well, and you
we
think
could
about
have
it,
been
we're cutting,
taking this problem off the table.
we've shut the entire economy down because of this Corona-19, which
Yes.
is a trivial risk when you compare it to what we're talking
What we're talking about here, right. But this one has never enjoyed, despite Peter's best efforts, and those of the commission and others of us, it has never enjoyed the kind of popular, sustained focus. Though I will tell you this, the number of people that I have come across, and Peter, this is no knock on Peter's extraordinarily important body of work, but Bill Fortune, in a book which has the foreword from Newt Gingrich called 1 Second After, has created an awareness across this country that I find all the time, because people come up to me and say, oh, you know, I read that book. Everybody in your audience ought to make it job one to read Bill Fortune's book, because once you've read it, you can't ignore this problem any longer, and you can't
Well, I want
accept
them to
the
read Dr.
excuses that are
Vincent-
made.
Peter Vincent Pry's book first.
That's
Thank you.
that's second. That's the second. Once Bill's got him, they'll read the rest of it.
Yeah, I hope Bill Fortune's book, becomes the equivalent of Rachel Carson's Silent
It should
Spring.
be.
Really?
You know, which,
So
It
it's
really
it's
should-
William Fortune?
yeah,
Fortune,
Bill Fortune.
like the
right,
magazine?
Right.
No, Fortschchen, I believe.
And as a matter of fact, there's a
Okay.
story behind that too, because Bill Fortune at first didn't want to write the book.
Is that right?
You know, the reason Newt Gingrich asked him to write the book is Congressman Bartlett and I briefed him on the EMP threat. And when
Briefed
Gingrich,
Newt.
pardon?
Briefed Newt.
Briefed Gingrich, right. And he became an EMP warrior with us, very concerned about it, racking his brain. What can we do, to try to get the country protected? And it was Gingrich's idea to ask Fortune, as a novelist, to try to educate the American people by writing
Right.
a novel about this that would describe the threat realistically.
A fictionalized
And-
account, but very
So
gripping.
this is a fictionalized
Very
account
real.
of what we're
Yes.
talking about right now.
And he
town
read the
in North
EMP Commission
Carolina.
reports and used
Yeah,
the
what's
EMP
the- what's the
Commission
title of the
reports.
book? I just-
1 Second After.
1
second after.
Yeah.
Yeah, he used the EMP Commission reports to inform. Now, the left is so dishonest, okay, that the EMP Commission has sometimes been criticized as, claiming that, our claim, for example, that 90% of the population could die from starvation is derived from Bill Fortune's book, which was published in 2009 after the EMP Commission was terminated the first time.
We're running out of time now, but I think we're going to have to do another show, because we've also got the whole politicization of this issue.
Yes.
Where you've got the deep state, it was Obama and the Obama holdovers that have basically been trying to sabotage what Trump's been
Yeah,
doing
there's
with his
ideological
executive
Bill,
order.
this goes back to what I
This is-
said
this
earlier.
This is crazy. I
This
mean,
is
everything
not,
is
this is not a
become-
political issue. It doesn't matter if
Well, it
this goes
shouldn't be.
down, whether you're Republican or Democrat, liberal or
You can be
conservative.
equally dead.
You will be equally dead. Your children will be equally dead.
Right.
And one of the things, if I could just put in a plug for work we've been doing as well.
With the center, which-
SecureTheGrid.com
Okay.
is a project that Peter has been very, very involved with from the get-go. It gives a lot of information, practical information about how people can help fix this problem, and I commend that to them as well.
Where can we find that?
SecureTheGrid.com.
Okay.
And
And
read
we can
Peter's
find you and all of your books on Amazon. And
Yeah, right.
where else can, you have a website that we can go to?
Oh, we do, but I don't remember the website.
We'll get it
I'm
up
a yellow pad generation
One-
guy.
one-
Volunteers, I have like 100 volunteers that work for the EMP Task Force, and they insisted that the EMP Task Force should have a website. But unfortunately,
We'll
I've
do
never
we'll do your
visited it
website.
myself.
You can find it through
We
our-
just rolled out a new website, and we have an interesting people section where we have a page for all of our guests. And so you can give us your list, and we'll make sure it's on there so people can learn more about what you doing from there. Final thoughts? Frank, you go first, and then
Well, my final thought is this, Bill. First of all, thank you for devoting your
important
time
issue.
and attention to this.
Yeah.
If you do another show on it, all the better. But
I think
this one should be a wake-up call. And all I'm saying is, against the backdrop of what we're seeing in America now, imagine what it would be like if, for example, those electric grid operators weren't at work, let alone if things were taken down. All of these are real-world problems that could be incalculably devastating to our country and to our population, and we can fix them. But we need to get about it.
I agree with Frank. We can fix it. The question is, will we? It's a question of political will, and I'm very much afraid we're running out of time. The sun isn't going to wait forever. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. I've never seen the country so threatened from so many directions. And when you combine that with the chaos on our streets, I'm afraid that to our adversaries, America looks a lot like 1968. You know, when most historians agree that was when we lost the Vietnam War psychologically. I mean, the temptation of us, challenging China in the South China Sea, Russia's designs on reconstructing the Soviet Union, the United States still not militarily recovered, and our nuclear deterrent, it's never been weaker compared to that. The stars are not well aligned to delay protecting ourselves from this existential threat for much longer.
We have senior Democrats, including the minority leader of the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer, saying he's going to cut 10% of the Defense Department budget. I mean, talk about inviting aggression at this very moment. And this could be the precursor, according to their doctrine, of such an attack.
Okay, well, Frank Gaffney, Peter Pry, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Extremely illuminating, and more to come, I hope. Anyway, thanks for watching The Bill Walton Show, and we will see you next time. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.